Thanks so much. And I would like to start this brief comments by thanking Armstrong Billings and, of course, Leonardo for their invitation. I also wanted to congratulate you because it's very seldom that we come to a session where we are, it's organized by an indigenous advocacy organization to showcase some of the good examples, maybe also some of the lessons learned of what the World Bank has done regarding indigenous peoples. When Armstrong talked to me and said, why don't you present the Awastigni example? We met many years ago precisely when he approached the bank to discuss the case of Awastigni because he learned that the bank was preparing a project, a land administration project in Nicaragua, for which I was the team leader at that point. So what I did, I tried to rescue some of the information, of course, and some of the old photos. And what I wanted to tell you is a little bit of the story of that case, not the case per se. It's not a case study yet, although we should work on that, but I wanted to tell you a little bit of the story. As you know, the case of Awastigni is greatly, if not, I would say, to a large extent, due to the resolution that I'm sure Leonardo explained at the beginning of this session of the Inter-American Human Rights. But that was not sufficient. When Armstrong came to the bank, he said, well, I heard that you're preparing a project for Nicaragua land administration to give title to everybody. That will include to give title to the colonos that are inside the indigenous lands. So basically what you're doing, you're going against this resolution of the Inter-American Court, and you're actually supporting the non-compliance of, that's how he used to talk now, it's much more moderate, but you're supporting the non-compliance of the resolution by the government of Nicaragua. Because by providing money to the government of Nicaragua to title colonos inside the indigenous lands, you're basically doing exactly the opposite of what you claim you're doing. And to tell you the truth, I thought I knew everything about Nicaragua land at that point, including indigenous lands, because my project, we used to call it my project, had an indigenous component. But it never occurred to me that the government could actually use the money of that component, the money of the land titling activities, to actually consolidate non-indigenous property within indigenous territories. To the contrary, I thought, we may have, the possibility to demarcate indigenous lands and everybody will be happy. I have to say that was my first land administration project. And last night when I was revisiting some of the notes, but actually I was going into the bank system, I learned that the bank is preparing the second land has approved already in March this year, the second land administration project in Nicaragua, and for that I was really very happy. So we engaged in a very constructive dialogue that lasted about a year with the indigenous communities themselves, but thanks to the contact and all the work that the American Indian Law Institute did, to the point that my chip changed, and I understood now that the government had a fantastic opportunity in this World Bank project to actually consolidate the indigenous lands, the indigenous territories, and to do what we call in Spanish the saneamiento, or the land regularization process within the indigenous territories in compliance, in full compliance with the Inter-American resolution. But that was very nice to discuss with Armstrong. I was convinced very, very soon, but it was very difficult to sell to the Minister of Finance, with whom I was actually dealing. I wasn't dealing with the Minister of Agriculture, we were dealing with the Minister of Finance. At the end of the day, I think that the court's resolution had a specific way, not solely because it was the Inter-American Court, but because it generated a lot of donor support. As Leonardo must have explained to you, there were many other parties, including Canadian indigenous, Indians, etc., that adhere to the complaint. So the government saw in this resolution also the voice of many others, many other countries, but many other indigenous organizations. At the end of the day, we managed to convince the government, and the government, in partnership with the World Bank and other donors, that was probably the famous leverage that the World Bank has. I had the opportunity to see it fully. Devise and rearrange the indigenous component to do two things, which were the most important ones. Number one, the consultation that the resolution mandated the government to do together with indigenous peoples for active demarcation of their lands. And two, of course, the physical demarcation and the regularization of property inside and in the frontier and borders of the indigenous lands. But we went a little bit further beyond, and I was just listening to Alf about the legal framework, how the legal frameworks are so important. We also established a component for legal and institutional reform. And thanks to this component, of course, the government created the Comisión Nacional de Tierras, created some other outfits in Nicaragua that I learned yesterday they are still alive, very strong, and have enabled not only the titling of our stigma, but more than 15 communities have been already titled due to this experience. So this was completely and fully replicated in the context of Nicaragua. This was just the seed and had a multiplier effect for which I think we have to congratulate the indigenous communities themselves, because they were very proactive, but also the NGOs that supported them and the donors that came along. So what I wanted to discuss with you today is, why was that such a successful example? And wasn't because only, let's say, they had it was the coincidence that I was just coming back from Bolivia to the World Bank, where in Bolivia I just did something similar with the indirect reform, and it wasn't just that it had the great luck to find an organization like the one that Armstrong leads. It was mainly because there was a collective action in place at that point. It wasn't just the indigenous communities, let's say this particular group, it was the full gamut of indigenous communities in Nicaragua behind this process, but also other indigenous groups or pro-indigenous groups in the region. So on the one hand. On the other hand, donors. The Dutch, I remember the Norwegian, IDB came along as well later, and so on. So we had a lot of traction there. The second thing that really made a difference was the proactive and constructive approach that we all took, including the communities after the resolution of the Human Rights Court. The communities were not in a fighting position, although actually they had all the elements to give the toughest fight to the government and give hard time to the regional governments, but the communities took the approach of, okay, now that you understand that you have to protect my rights, how can we work together to make that happen? And this was actually probably the key to the success. And of course, highlighting a little bit, because I know there are many NGOs here, what I call the smart advocacy. Because advocacy can be done by many, but smart advocacy, which is finding the right place at the right time, at the right tone, and make the linkage, direct linkage with the community. Those are some of the elements of the smart advocacy. I think that's what happened with the Indian Law Institute. The other aspect of this example that I wanted to highlight is that it wasn't so important, and I can tell you that now, many years later, the titling part. What was most important was the demarcation. And with some of my former land colleagues, we used to have extensive endless discussions about how important titles are. I think that titles, in the context of indigenous people's realities, are important, but not so much as if they are not enforced. And the way to enforce this property is by providing tenure security. One of the instruments to provide tenure security is demarcating. When we are not talking about demarcation on the maps in my office or the surveyor's office, we are talking about participatory demarcation with the communities. That's why in my first slide you see the pictures when they plant the, I forgot the word in English, but
Stakes.
the stakes, yeah. More than a stakes, big stakes.
Monuments.
Okay, so the other element that provided enormous tenure security to the community was that the government ended almost immediately, thanks to the resolution, but also in the process of demarcation, any concession in the area. Not only the famous Socalca or whatever concession, but other concessions. Maybe the reality today is different, and I know there are some issues, but at that point was the right decision. And this is something that not many countries in the region can afford in a given point. Of course, the enforcement of the legal instruments in Nicaragua had already a constitution that protected the indigenous territories, and the rest just followed. That was also a very important aspect. And the court, as you said, as I'm sure Leonardo explained, committed to follow on the compliance of this resolution. That also gave extra strength to the government. The government needed to report to the court. I remember in one of those reports, the government sent me a note to the World Bank saying, we are going to report that with the help of the World Bank, we are demarcating the indigenous people's lands because, number one, that's true, number two, that gives us much more credibility. And that's how they reported to the court. So I think that was also very important for the case. So I was mentioning the effects beyond Awastigni. So far, I think my numbers are a little bit off, but 15 square kilometers, and you have more than 130 indigenous communities titled and with protection over their rights. This is an example for Latin America as well. This is how the map, the Nicaragua map, unfortunately I couldn't find other, it's the indigenous territories in the RAN, the RAS, and special areas, special protection areas, all of them. So imagine, now it's close to 15% or 12% of the territory demarcated in favor of indigenous people. So it's a great progress. Just to finish, what I learned revisiting some of the project documents is that after we have done that, not only that this was replicated in other indigenous communities areas, but the cadastral law was passed, another law for the national land policy framework was passed, and so on. The public registration law was also, that took like 3 years of project preparation. I left before that was approved, so I was very happy to see that was finally up. And of course, there is another operation from the World Bank now in place to continue to support the indigenous peoples, but also land administration more broadly in Nicaragua. I'll stop there.